All right, time to come clean. What if I told you I didn't just grow up like a regular person, as you would think of what is regular, but what is regular, what is normal? I grew up in a system. I grew up in a cult. I'm going to tell you about how I escaped it. It wasn't a community, definitely, and it wasn't a culture, right? And I'm just trying to explain the difference to people between a cult and a culture. And I don't know, by the end of this video, maybe the only difference is the U-R-E on the end, and really a cult and a culture are the same thing. I don't know, but I'm just telling you this. I was definitely raised from birth in definitely a conditioning chamber, definitely a cult. And let me tell you, it was from, gosh, this is difficult. From the very second I was born, I didn't welcome me into the world, I was immediately had my tie severed with my mother, and they loaded me full of toxic chemicals. And that was just before I could even be aware and have any really memory of what was going on, But as I started to develop, and have memory from a baby into a toddler into a child, eventually, there's things like church and school, and I'm going to tell you about the kind of cult within these churches and schools I was raised in. There were sports and schedules and things like that, but none of this stuff was aimed at letting me be my own unique person. This is all designed. It was all designed to basically assign who I was supposed to be and kind of make me a product of the cult, right? And so as soon as I'm in school and we're going to talk about church and a little bit the type of church I went to, and the whole sports culture in this cult I was in. It's there's team colors, there's mascots, there's this tribal identity where they my elders would get drunk and fight people just because they were the other sports ball team, right? And it was almost to encourage this warlike or tribal mentality, right? And I think they expose that to us partially because, of those things. And it made me felt like I belonged, but that wasn't the goal of it ultimately, I don't think. And I think within this cult I grew up in, they make belonging feel like a drug almost, right? And they want people to crave belonging. And basically they're isolated if they don't belong. So the people in this cult, they sacrifice the truth in order to keep that feeling of belonging, right? And everybody in this cult thought they were just having fun, but the whole time what was kind of going on was everyone's identity was being controlled, assigned, and kind of outsourced, right? It's a tribal decision implanted onto us by this cult I was raised in. And I'll tell you what cult it was later, but, I remember early on when I started to see things what I felt were kind of magic, right? Or just would see imaginary friends or maybe remember past life or something. Just the wonder, the mystery, the big questions, right? That wasn't nurtured in this cult I grew up in. It was actively stamped out and called overactive imagination, and it was called childish, and curiosity just discouraged in every way, and magic is a thing of fairy tales, and mystery is stupid, and anything outside this approved box of this cult is a delusion, and you get attacked for it, right? And then I, got in learning in school, right? And what I ended up finding out later in this cult that I was in, these textbooks were written decades ago. All are outdated models, outdated assumptions, outdated worldviews. And when I really found out who was writing the books and responsible for the curriculum in this cult that I was in the school within the cult, it made me question if what I was reading was the truth or if it was propaganda, So it almost seemed that my school in this cult wasn't designed to create free thinkers. It was designed to like create obedience and memorization rather than intuition or anything, right? It's like memorize, regurgitate, obey, and no room for, well, why? Or like, how do you know? Or what if that's wrong, right? It's just always been this way. And just silly, incomplete answers to school questions and religious questions, right? Then these questions weren't celebrated like they should be if I was raised in a philosophical culture, but I was raised in a cult, right? So they were, discouraged basically because I don't know why. Would they destabilize the authority? And the same thing happened in church, right? Everything is doctrine. Everything is final. And I started asking like questions at this church that I went to in this cult I grew up in. And I could tell they thought I was prideful or I lacked faith and I just needed to believe, or they labeled me like rebellious for like, and I never thought for a minute it was because I was wrong, right? It's like, well, they don't know the answer, right? So I'm prideful because I'm thinking for myself, right? So this cult didn't want thinkers, right? They wanted blind obedience, right? They wanted followers, and it's almost like they wanted compliance dressed up as a virtue, right? So you could virtue signal that you were in line with everybody else and shun everybody else in the cult if there was somebody who stepped out of line. So I think that the real curriculum in this cult I grew up in, right, in the school and in the overall vibe of the cult was behavior training, basically, right? Especially in school. Sit still, raise your hand, wait your turn, don't disrupt, put absolute blind faith and trust in authority. Again, I don't think the lessons in my cult were knowledge or and definitely the lesson was more like submission, right? So, but the thing is when you're young, and you're in a cult, you don't notice that. So it happens like in a frog in boiling water where they don't realize the water's turning up until they're boiling, right? I think if I was dropped into this cult all at once, I would have realized how hot the water was. But it kind of happened in a slow creep, invisible, micro change, progressive, normalized way, right? And by the time I was old enough to realize what was going on in this cult, it's like I didn't even realize it happened, right? It's so weird, right? And within this cult I was raised in, it was really, 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 really pushed that there were like pretty much uniform beliefs, right? And just like this disregard for questioning, reward for obedience, societal pressure to conform, identities that tied up into like group approvals. And it's almost like that I didn't grow up in a culture, right? Those are cult mechanics. It may seem like a soft or sneaky or sly or friendly or a smile and wave cult, right? But and the thing is weird. When it's the cult I grew up in, nobody like wore robes or chanted or anything like that. It was almost disguised as a benevolent culture, right? Blended in. But at some point I realized, right, that basically, my mind is not for rent, right? And the things that I was being asked to believe weren't my beliefs. They were inherited. And this identity that thought I had was just a shell that was assembled by other people, by the cult I was in, right? Again, never taught how to think or encourage, but only taught what to memorize, right? And I think that a person like that is not very controllable, right? So I think that's why all this was discouraged. Oh God, in this cult I grew up in. So I don't even know if this is necessarily about exposing the specific cult that I grew up in, but it's more about like awareness of the template, right? A template that teaches you to give up agency, right? Any cult that teaches you to give up agency. I guess any culture too that teaches you to give up agency, right? And replaces love with fear and prioritize safety instead of like sovereignty and agency, right? And why though? Why, right? Not to empower people and help them see and wake up and have agency, right? But to fit in, right? And to make sure that everything that they wanted was like a conditioned response and a repeatable program, right? There's no chinks in the armor. There's no bugs in the system. And I think sometimes if if at any point any of us realize that we're like raised in a cult, I think the absolute bravest thing that somebody can do is just start to, unlearn everything, because, our brains can be reprogrammed. We can undo it, unprogram it. We can unplug from the source of that cult, which was basically indoctrination. And what's sad is that some people end up, even if they try and realize this, I've had friends that have realized this, but they can't escape from the cult, even though they realize it, because they start having Stockholm syndrome. They, for some reason, start identifying and having sympathy for and popping up almost like an Agent Smith in the Matrix to defend their brainwashing and indoctrination because of Stockholm syndrome or because of like cognitive dissonance, right? Because in this cult that I was raised in, they shape our entire identity around these beliefs, right? So psychologically what happens is most people can't even begin to question that, even if they have an inkling that it's not true and they've been fooled, right? Because it would shatter their whole identity, and they can't handle that. So their psychological condition called cognitive dissonance springs up and won't even let them look at it and cause them to attack it and defend their captors, right? Stockholm syndrome, cognitive dissonance. And this is much like Mark Twain, the quote from Mark Twain. He says, it's easier to fool somebody than it is to convince them they've been fooled. And I don't think anybody convinced me that I was raised in a cult, right? I just figured it out. And I think that one needs to become real to get out of it, because I think that the moment that we all start having some agency and thinking for ourselves, that even if we were raised part of a cult or like a cult disguised as a culture, we can we're no longer part of that cult and we're free, right? So I guess this is the point in the video. There's about a minute left. I'll go ahead and tell you. I'm kind of scared that they'll come after me if I throw out the cult, but I guess I value truth and honesty, and ultimately I have no fear, right? So the cult was the United States of America, the Christian Catholic Church, the U.S. educational system, and just the culture, the overall culture of the United States of America. And I'm very, very, very happy that I escaped from that cult, that I realized that I was in a cult disguised as a culture, and that I now have agency and can think for myself. I encourage all of you who find that you're in a cult one day to wake up and do the same thing. I've got a Patreon if you want early access to some of my videos or one-on-one chats with me. You can support it for as low as $1.11 per month. And then there's a Discord, too, where I have a growing community of people who have escaped their cult, too, and are cultivating a loving, welcome community for escaped cult members. So come join us there. You can submit ideas for future videos. I pop in there, and, there's PMs there for me if you want to chat with me. Otherwise, share this with a friend. Like it for the algorithm. Peace. Love y'all.